Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luhr, and I'm excited to be back after a short break with a new podcast, and even more excited to cross over today to Berlin, Germany, to catch up with my buddy, Philipp Grothe. Philipp, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Marcus. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to have you on the line. And obviously, we've been talking a bit here the last few weeks when I was back in Germany as well over the holidays. And I know you have tons of great stories. Some are recordable, others we will not be sharing with the world, but all of them are great. And we know there's a lot of interesting information here. Again, of what the sports marketing industry did over the last 25 years of your own career. And that's obviously, as usual, we'll be digging deep into it. And so let me just sort of give a quick intro on yourself for everyone who might not know you. Philipp is from Germany originally, studied in Hamburg, and from there ended up with UFA Sports, which obviously was a top agency in those days, which nowadays is called Sport 5 again. It went through various incarnations, captured some of that already with Robert Müller before. We'll hear lots more great stuff from UFA Sports here from Philipp, and several years with IMG, and of course, probably most well-known, Philipp is for his own agency, KENTARO, which had a strong run for almost over a decade out of London. And so we're going to dig into all this great stuff from obviously starting the career to being an entrepreneur in the industry. So, but as we always do, we'll go right back to where it all started, studying law in Hamburg. And there's a bit of some fun stories there, what you were actually doing a bit on the outside, on the side of it. Philipp, tell us.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I studied law in Hamburg in the late 80s and early 90s of the last century.
It
sounds like years ago. Yeah, and obviously in the sports rights business is already a couple of ages, I would say. And yes, I did a lot of things apart from studying law. I don't know if I ever did some sleeping in that time. I was basically running my own little advertising agency with 10 employees. I was basically very much into the music business and had a band where I had, 250 gigs a year. I was running my own 2 clubs. And yes, apart from that, I also studied some law. And I have to say, we discussed that recently, that all of these side businesses, being in the entertainment and show business, also helped me later in my career, because it had a lot of things to do with marketing and, of course, also selling yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then basically right after my university, I ended up actually as an intern in a young German sports rights agency called UFA Sports, which you have just mentioned. At that time, this was part of CAT, which was again part of the Bertelsmann group. Mm-hmm. And for Bertelsmann at that time, second biggest media group in the world after Time Warner, right. Had bundled all their electronic business, which was at that time minority shareholding in the RTL television group and in some radio stations. Mm-hmm. And of course, they had a little sports rights agency. UFA was at that time known because they had for the first time in history as a private agency the Bundesliga rights for the German market. Okay. But they lost them against the big rival in Munich. We were all based in Hamburg, the Kirch Group. So Bertelsmann had to decide if they would have closed this new venture or if they would continue and reinvent themselves. And so they said at the end, let's do some trading in sports rights business. And that's where we all started.
Interesting. So and just to give everyone a sense of timing here. So we're in 94, right? 94, 95, when you started there after university. So in the mid 90s, in the world of sports, over 25 years back. Now, besides that, UFA Sports was part of Bertelsmann, which sort of already gives a sense that, there is obviously some serious firepower behind, with this huge, media group. But I understand UFA Sports wasn't there was several components to it, right? I think you mentioned something from athletics to golf and tennis, and so maybe talk us through a little bit there. What were the different pieces of UFA at that time before we get into your part of it?
Yeah, basically UFA, as I mentioned, was a little trading business on 2 floors. There was a film department, which actually wanted to compete against Mighty Kirch, who was basically controlling a big part of the German film trading business and European trading business, and a sports rights division, which at that time had 4 equal divisions. That was tennis, which was a big sport in the early 90s in Germany, to Steffi Graf and Boris Becker. Yeah. There was a track and field department, a golf department, and there was a tiny little football department with a couple of guys who all made quite impressive careers later in the sports rights industry. But this little nucleus was dealing with international and also German football. What you need to understand is that in principle, sports rights marketing, which we all know, of course, of today, in the center of Europe, apart from the UK, was just invented because there were 2 major factors. One was that the entire size of the business area doubled overnight after the Iron Curtain fall down. So basically the number of federations and clubs in European competitions increased massively due to the downfall of Soviet Union.
Interesting timing. We're talking about that, right?
Yes, exactly. Some people want to restore it again. And obviously, another major factor was that at the same time, in most of the European countries, private television stations, for the first time, allowed to be in the market.
Right. Competing against the state-owned sort of channels which were there before, right?
A good example, until the late 80s, we only had 1 or 2 state-owned programs, and suddenly all these new stations who appeared on the market had one massive issue. They needed very quickly high ratings, and that means live sport, and in Europe, live sport means football. So the broadcasting rights, who existed, of course, before, became suddenly overnight very valuable.
Got it. So when you joined these guys, what was sort of your first thing you guys were doing? What was the sort of rights you guys already were trading or dealing with at that time?
Well, it was very hands-on. Don't forget, at that time, I think we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have internet. We had a fax machine on our desk. Actually, we had a printer next to our computer. And when we sent out what you would do today with a mail, or a phone call, you basically printed a one-pager, went to the fax machine and sent it around the world. The rights we were dealing with were mainly European Cup rights and national team qualifiers, because all of these rights were at that time not centralized. I'll give you an example. European Cup at that time was divided in UEFA Cup, the Champions Cup on a Wednesday. UEFA Cup was played on a Tuesday, and we had on Thursday the Cup Winners' Cup. 3 more or less equal competitions with a host of clubs from all over Europe. Right. Who regularly went to Geneva and to the Noga Hilton for the draw ceremonies. And that was, quite funny events, because you had a couple of thousand crazy people from all over the world waiting for the draw results, much less organized than you can see it today. And of course, you had a vibrant agency scene with a lot of people who saw the opportunities here and were trying to get a piece of the cake.
Who were the other players at that time? Who were sort of the agencies who were already out there competing in this space?
We had basically in Germany, as I mentioned, Bertelsmann. There was always the big competitor, the Kirch Group, with a couple of different agencies who were under control of Kirch, ESPR, CWL, Kirchsport, who all later became then ultimately in front. There were some smaller agencies from London. CSI is a good example. And then there were some Italian agencies based in Milan and Rome. So a lot of smaller smaller and tiny players. It was quite funny. I remember my first day in office at UFA. I was basically handed over a file because there was just an UEFA Cup final between Inter Milan and Casino Salzburg. UFA had the rights of the Austrian club Salzburg, and I was basically ordered to sell third-party television rights around the globe.
Right.
On my first hours at office, So I dialed some numbers and sent emails, and I always remember I sold for a couple of $1,000 third-party rights of an UEFA Cup final to the Middle East. An older lady who was running ART, an Arabian pay broadcaster.
Yes.
We all know probably.
What's her name, Lena?
Exactly, it was Lena.
I know her.
I was at the time buying, and my dad called me after my first day at office and asked, "How was your day?" And I said, "Daddy, you can't believe it. I sold for $6,000 television rights to Arabia." And that was basically my first day.
Nice.
Very interesting, because in hindsight, we might smile about it, but it shows you that Bertelsmann at that time was a very liberal, decentralized company who gave to even lower managers like us a lot of freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Which ultimately I think we paid back, But I wouldn't say that this is possible, that you basically on day one now start selling the crown jewels of a company.
That's true. So obviously you spent 5 years there. So, in those 5 years, I know a lot of things grew and your role, of course, became bigger and bigger. So let's talk a bit about that because, these stories, and you hear it all the time. I speak to others as well about how these rights were traded, and suitcases full of money was sort of handed out in the hotels, to capture it, and sometimes even the rights just doubled and tripled without. Whatever, within one trading session, just pick up a few of those. I think, Poland, you mentioned before, was one of those where just, the numbers just exploded.
Yeah, I mean, it was a booming market, which later we witnessed this also in a couple of other situations, and maybe even in today's world when we're talking about things like NFT rights, etc. It's a little bit business as usual. So it was a booming market because it was a market which was just created, and a lot of your business success was connected to speed and basically taking opportunities. I mentioned before there were a lot of new territories and countries, which meant always a lot of new business. And I traveled the world. Probably I have seen in that time every club in the professional leagues of Europe, which we try to visit and then to sign and to convince. Because typical German business attitude, I mentioned before, the draw ceremonies of UEFA and the UEFA competitions. We at Germans, at a German company from Bertelsmann, again came very structured and strategic into the business and said, well, this is one big lottery. Let's try to buy all the lots here in order to have a guaranteed success. So we tried to sign as many clubs and federations as possible in order to have biggest commercial chances when the draw ceremonies would appear. And therefore, you couldn't basically go wrong, because even if you would have acquired rights to premium prices, ultimately you were always able to sell at higher prices because the market was doubling and tripling every 2 years.
Amazing.
Which needs, of course, certain skills, especially also when you were selling rights, because I mentioned before that broadcasters needed these football rights, especially national team games, were so big strategic rights. I remember I used to be involved in a couple of deals with big European national team games, which had to be acquired by some broadcasters. So when you were discussing with your opponent component. It was never a question if or when they would buy it. It was only the question for how much,
what level?
which obviously need also certain skills. We all know this, that you pressure out the highest price, but at the same time do not destroy your relationships to the missing parties or basically to your main clients here.
Absolutely. Now, when you guys were buying these rights, was it mostly third party and second party rights, or would you have for the home country as well, or how was that structured at that time?
Yeah, it was of course also the case in certain territories. In a lot of cases, and here we are coming already to the role of an agency, it was basically difficult for a German agency to buy first-party rights of a club in the UK, because they basically had their own relationships to Sky or the BBC. So as a Hamburg-based agency, you hardly could add value here. And due to the intransparency of the markets, of course, our strength was knowing the markets, especially the second-party rights markets, because, again, third-party rights, how we call it, and also other rights were hardly developed. I just mentioned that I sold the UEFA Cup final for $6,000 to the territory of MENA, but obviously this has changed now dramatically. And when you see that revenues of the Premier League are, when it comes to foreign sales, bigger than the domestic deal, it gives you a good impression how this market has developed as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. And obviously all of that was before the centralization. So unfortunately, well, to some degree, I guess you could argue some of that has all gone away now with these rights now centralized either in team or, of course, in CAA. Where now it all sits there, but that comes a bit later, so we'll come a bit back to that because that obviously was it's more when you had KENTARO. Let's just before we move on maybe to IMG, let's just chat a bit about obviously the power of football during that time as well, right? It was not just sports, right? It was politics. You had politicians owning football clubs. So there was, this was always a whole lot more. I'm not saying it's not anymore today, but even in those times already, right, it was quite obvious.
Absolutely, yeah. And as a German, it's sometimes difficult to understand. Although football in Germany is, of course, the biggest sport and has a tremendous public power. It's nothing when you look into other territories in Europe, where football is like a religion. Look at Italy, look at Spain, a lot of other territories like Turkey, etc. I'm always saying that probably the president of FC Barcelona is more important than the president of Catalonia. Nice. And therefore, you, of course, came into contact and direct touch with a lot of important people. Take as an example Silvio Berlusconi, who I met a couple of times because his political career and his success was very close connected to the race. AC Milan, which basically is a good example because in Italy, football was more than just a game. These clubs had tremendous political power because ultimately fans also were voters and were also used by politicians, to strengthen their fan base.
Yep, absolutely.
I remember I was once in a strange position. There was, for the World Cup in France, very strange draw result where Italy and England were drawn in one group, and we had the rights of the World Cup qualifying game, England versus Italy. Mm-hmm. So just one little game, and it was very difficult for me to sell it because at that time there was a kind of cartel situation between Mediaset and RAI, and basically no one was offering a market price. Ultimately, I was able to sell it for, I think, still a record price for a national team game in Italy to a guy called Cecchi Gori, who at that time was trying to establish a third power in the Italian media scene with his own television group, Tele Monte Carlo. And he acquired just this single national team game in order to get missing frequencies to guarantee full coverage of his channels throughout Italy. And it shows you that basically, with one little national team game, you could create politics.
Amazing.
And sometimes we were buying on the market entire packages so that you basically had 4 home games or even 4 away games, or basically the entire game package of a national team in one qualification period. And with these little packages, you could create entire new channels on the back of just 4 or 5 national team games, which is illustrating the tremendous strategic value of these rights at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think if we, if we fast forward a bit over the next couple of decades, then you had, pay TV showing up, which again drove, huge growth in other parts of the world, not always in the same areas necessarily as what you just described with these private channels. Then you had, the telco companies coming in with IPTV, now you have, OTT platforms showing up. And of course, you mentioned NFTs and others. So there's always there's an evolution to it, but sometimes it still boils down to the same thing, right? It's the content itself which drives these new platforms.
Sure. Let me come back at one stage also, or one more time here to the European Cup competitions. I know that you're also from Germany now. We all got raised by these Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday European Cup days during the season, with which I just mentioned, 3 equal competition formats. Where I would estimate the commercial value 30, 40, 30 between the UEFA Cup, the Champions League, and the Cup Winners' Cup, and which basically created international revenues, which of course were smaller than today's money, but still quite significant at that time, because a German club got, for a European Cup game, something like 2-3 million German marks at that time, plus advertising and ticket revenues, which was a lot of money at that time. But what I wanted to say, that this, in most of the leagues, have created a kind of competitiveness in the top third of the domestic leagues, which due to the Champions League, who absorbed most of the money and was basically for the first 20 years very much promoted by UEFA, because as you remember, they abolished the UEFA Cup, the Cup Winners' Cup, in order to have a second day for the UEFA Cup. And then basically for the first 10 to 15 years, the old UEFA Cup, which later became Europe League, was also not treated very well by UEFA in order to promote the Champions League. This has created basically over the foundation of the monster we have now, and the economic situation in most of the leagues, that you have a couple of top clubs who consistently become champions in their domestic leagues, and a much lower competitiveness in many of the top European leagues.
Well, and there's no one bigger than Germany, I guess, really, right? Where Bayern Munich has been dominating. God knows how many, what is it now, 9 years in a row, or whatever many years it is?
Now the 10th one. Look at Italy with Juventus. England is different due to the investors, but we have the same situation in Spain, and a lot of other territories. Right. And still you could say, as a club, if you win or if you're participating 2 or 3 times in a row the Champions League, then the distance to your next competitors who do not qualify to the Champions League is massive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. The other day I read about the sort of discussion. It's obviously just early days about a playoff in the Bundesliga to again mix it a bit up and give others maybe a chance to still beat Bayern, even if you can't beat them over a whole season, So, I think those are definitely ideas which need to be explored, because it will get boring. Or it is boring already, I guess, unless you're a Bayern fan.
Absolutely. And I think there are a lot of studies, it's, I think the biggest issue for a league when you do not have competition. No? It's a little bit like you would go into a cinema watching a movie and you know about the end. Yep. Definitely you do not go into a cinema and watch 10 times the same movie, yeah, knowing the outcome of it. And I see this as a massive danger. And you see other sports where it's very, very difficult to defend the title. Of course, the Champions League is a good example here, yeah, but have a look at the NFL, where this competitiveness is always guaranteed also by the system. And I think it's something where the leagues and the responsible people in the leagues need to have a very careful look at.
No, I agree. So now let's wrap up UFA a bit here. So you spent 5 years there, hanging out with our buddy Robert and Lars and others who obviously had illustrious careers as well in the industry. And I think you had Philipp Huber, right? Your partner later on as well. Was he already in UFA as well?
Well, he was independent in Switzerland, and at the end of 99, I mean, I used to live in Hamburg. I really liked this, but at that time I said, well, this can't be the end of your career. And there were also certain things which at that time I didn't really like on Germany, which, funny enough, were the same reasons why I later returned 20 years later. Yeah, but at that time, Mark McCormack, who was basically inventing sports rights marketing and was the founder and president of IMG, decided also to get a bigger footprint into football. IMG, as you know, was in a lot of other sports like golf and tennis, the clear number one. And someone told McCormack, well, if you really want to be number one, then you also need to get into the football business. So we had a couple of discussions, and then he basically asked us to join IMG and to run the new IMG football division. Somehow we had
who was us, just to define that?
Yeah, we were a couple of guys here, and ultimately we convinced McCormack very quickly by our idea of a house of football. That's how we called it, where we were combining broadcasting rights, an event division, and also the management of players. Okay. Which was pretty much the same IMG did in golf and in tennis as well.
Right. Okay, so you became the managing director international football, right? Based in London. So you moved from Hamburg to London, and then again, how did you guys start? You started to obviously compete with your previous agencies and going after the same rights, or you guys had a slightly different focus with that what was that, House of Football?
Yeah, it was, of course, very interesting because Bertelsmann at that time was a very German company in hindsight. It was a headquarter in Gütersloh, a little city, or I would say village near Bielefeld, yeah. And IMG's headquarter was at that time in Cleveland, Ohio, which was probably the Gütersloh of the US, yeah. But of course, it was also a massive culture shock and difference, yeah. And very interesting to see how an American group works, yeah. And at that time, IMG, I have to say, in all fairness, that in the last days of McCormack, IMG wasn't in the best shape. There were a lot of old fat cats and a lot of young talents who left the agency. There were some economic issues in the agency. But I had the feeling that McCormack always knew very exactly what's going on. I met him a couple of times, a very impressive guy, and he wanted to have some fresh blood. So we, with our hands-on European football skills, came into a company where the culture was pretty much American and also influenced by the culture of golf and tennis marketing, which is completely different than the football industry. Right. At that time, IMG was divided into a television part, TWI, and event and players division, which was mainly in sponsorship business at IMG. So this was also I would say, not the most lucky structure, because there were also some political conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. But we were very successful because obviously the brand name of IMG was always fantastic. And I would say that was one of the biggest achievements, that when someone at that time was thinking about sports business, then there was only one real super agency on a global basis, which was IMG. All the other competitors, especially the ones in Europe now, were much smaller. And IMG, due to its tradition, had an incredible relationship to big corporations, especially in the US. Mm. And they had a big understanding also for the players' business, a very booming business in the early part of the century, because the Bosman verdict came just out, and everyone realized that power and the money which would go into the pockets of the players would tremendously grow. Mm-hmm. So we were focusing also on this, an area which I didn't touch before, because at Bertelsmann we always said players' business is not a business for a group. Right. So we quickly decided also to create a super agency by basically buying out a couple of major players' agencies in Europe and combine them, which had the full backing of McCormack and the board, because I think they did similar things in tennis and in golf, and that's what we did.
He knew what to do. He knew that part. But I remember when we spoke before, of course, on this, that didn't all work out necessarily in all areas, right? Buying agents who many times are their own guy. They're very much so this lone wolf, one man show. Putting them into a corporate structure isn't quite as simple as it sounds like, right? So tell us a bit about that.
Exactly. Yeah, because I think in order to be a successful players agent, you indeed need certain skills. Yeah, you just mentioned the word lonely wolf. Yeah, these were real special characters at that time. Yeah, most of them were former used carpet dealers, or some of them were sales representatives in a car dealership around the corner, and became then very successful players agents. I would say there's no big difference in when you look at today's scene. Yeah, that a lot of very successful players agents had a very interesting career and background. Yeah, and so definitely it was very difficult to incentivize these guys to work in a bigger cooperation. And I remember, I think one of our ideas to consolidate the business was always to create so-called agent summits where all of them came to one place in Europe to coordinate transfers and actions. And it was very hard even to agree on a common date, because just out of their own interest, when someone proposed Monday, the answer was, I don't meet on a Monday, I can only do on Tuesday, and vice versa. So you could see it's very, very difficult to industrialize.
Was it because there were just this constant competition between them? Is that where it comes from?
One of them, and these are people, and their skills and their background was basically very, very far away from coordination, from teamwork, from scaling businesses. And I have to say, to a certain degree, I would still agree that this would even work today, because obviously when you're a successful agent, you can earn a lot of money, but you do this always by fighting for a host of individual clients you are managing. And since it's a personal business, it's clear that the size of your business is also limited, because you cannot offer personal service for 100 players. And right. That's one of the big issues. Another thing, which of course is for a bigger group also a big challenge, is budgeting and managing and forecasting, because it's of course a very versatile business. And if one of your guys has a broken leg and a transfer is not happening, then
There
it has
goes
a big
the budget.
on your P&A.
Yeah, that's for sure. So the 3 years you were there, I remember you mentioned before. You obviously, you had some interaction with Mark, before he passed away, I guess, and then you have, characters like Bob Kane and Alistair Johnson you mentioned before, which were, I guess, de facto number 2 and 3 in the company, and again, as a sort of young hotshot out of Germany, there trying to tell these big boys in the US how it works in football. Didn't always work, come across that well, right? So, you guys have stories on that?
Yeah, I remember. I think my first ever meeting in IMG's headquarters in Cleveland was in front of McCormack and basically the board of IMG, which were a host of top industrials from all over the US. Yeah, and at that time, basically the number 2 of IMG, Bob Kane, made an introduction speak and was talking about his future football industry, football strategy. And McCormack blatantly went to me and said, "Philipp, what do you think about this?" And at that time, I was very young, very German, very undiplomatic. And I said to Mark, "This is the biggest bullshit I've ever heard." Yeah? The reaction was that the entire room, especially the board, including McCormack, was laughing. I think Bob Kane wasn't at that time anymore my biggest friend, yeah. And of course, he was a legend, yeah. I think Jerry Maguire was filmed after his career. It shows you a little bit that McCormack, although he was very old, yeah, was a brilliant guy, yeah, because he liked these situations and he liked when people were direct, yeah, and non-diplomatic. He was a businessman. But it, of course, at that time, we are talking here in the year 2000, I would say the competence for the football business was not necessarily in Cleveland, yeah, because the MLS just started, yeah, and they had a complete different approach towards the football industry than we Europeans, yeah. Sure. Have changed, of course, because we now have a lot of successful American people working in the football industry, but at that time it was a very young business in the US.
No, that makes sense. Now, there's another story which you shared last time about you spending some of Mr. McCormack's money, I think without maybe checking in or so, and then there was some interaction there, and his particular comment to you, how you used the money, or your comment to him, which he obviously liked. Why don't you share that story?
Well, we were basically warned, yeah, that IMG was pretty much run by controllers, yeah, and there was a very strict financial regime in the company, yeah. But of course, I knew this also from Bertelsmann. A lot of people said Bertelsmann would have been run by controllers. Kirch definitely wasn't run by controllers, and we all know the outcome. And there were a couple of situations. I remember I had to go into the office of McCormack because at one of these television exhibitions, Sportville, I spent $500 on 2 bottles of red wine and put them as an expense into my expenses claim. And for these $500, I was called into the office of McCormack explaining why I spent $500. Yeah? But on that time, I think we closed a multi-million-dollar deal with Eurosport in a restaurant in Miami. Actually, it was Nikki Beach, the first Nikki Beach ever. And as you could imagine, the French management of Eurosport, they ordered red wine, yeah, and very expensive red wine. So I explained this to McCormack and said, yes, I spent $500, but we closed here whatever, $20 million deal. And he said, oh, that's fine, perfect. And the same he basically did when I once spent a little higher sum on an option acquiring a major company, and he asked me, oh, why did you spend this, etc. And I said, look, Mark, I'm always using your money like it's mine, yeah? And he said, he came across his desk, gave me a hug and said, that's the right answer. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you. Please continue.
Right. Yeah, I like that. I mean, unfortunately, I have never met Mark. Obviously, read all the books and heard many stories about him, but that does show what an entrepreneur he was. And like being an entrepreneur yourself, or both of us, I think that is the sort of things we want to see. If not just, of course, saying it, but employees or people working with us doing it. So I think it's a great story, and it's an important point to bring across. Now,
Yeah,
I know. Please go ahead.
We talked about the importance now of national team games and the strategic value at that time. And we got him then relatively quickly some important rights. And one was a Germany away game, which IMG was controlling thanks to our work. And at that time, I mentioned before, at UFA, we were involved in tennis, but the big tennis boom in Germany ended after Becker, later Stich and Graf. Right. Went into retirement, and IMG's key property also for a long time was the Wimbledon television rights. And they could never sell Wimbledon anymore into German TV, which of course was a massive issue for the Wimbledon club because it was one of the biggest markets. Sure. And then suddenly, by bundling the rights, we were able together, due to the German national team games, to bring it back into German free TV. And that, of course, was very much in favor of McCormack and IMG.
The bundling trick. Yeah, we all did that.
Yeah, the old bundling trick. And they realized apparently about the strategic importance then of football, and then of course the power of bundling TV rights.
Yep, that's the oldest agency trick in the books. Now, did Mark pass away while you were there, or when did that?
Relatively quickly, and then the company, I think, went even into Chapter 11 or something like this. So later was then bought by Forsman. So a lot of people left the agency. And it was also clear that football, or the business, how we were basically dealing with football, didn't have a huge future in IMG. It was probably a little bit too much away from their core business. And also at that time, financially, they couldn't manage to raise massive guarantees, etc. And we all know football was always a cash business, and that was at that time a big issue at IMG. So we decided to leave IMG, and were sitting in London in a restaurant, and came up to eventually create our own agency, like a lot of people did at this point in their career. And that's how we basically...
That's how KENTARO was born.
Exactly.
That's right.
KENTARO basically is a Central African word meaning lion mother, female warrior. So basically we said we want to treat our clients like little lions, and we are the lion mother. And it was a very lucky time because 2003 was the beginning of the next economic boom after the dot-com bubble was burst. And I think the next financial crisis was 2008, 2009, although football was pretty much apart from that. So we had a good timing here. We had a lot of know-how. We were already in our 40s, so we were established people. We had a good contact network and created a little tiger here, and a very much growing business.
And this was you and Philipp now, the other Philipp, or who else was all part of when you started KENTARO?
We were basically the founding partners. We then had some investors in, but in principle, it was the two of us running the company.
Two Phillips. Right. But you mentioned you started in the Barclays Hotel in London before you got kicked out and had to find yourself an office, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was a flying start. Yeah, we basically had a meeting actually in the Barclays Hotel in the breakfast room because it was next to my house in London. And we were thinking of creating something new, but before we even were thinking about a name or a structure, we already had the first UEFA Cup rights of a couple of clubs from Cyprus and Greece in our book. And I think the next draw was already the day after, so we started immediately with business. And then probably we became so big and so noisy that we eventually were kicked out of the Barclays Hotel's breakfast room and ended in a little room sub-rented from one of our partners and investors in the center of London. And
cool.
It's just the four of us in a little room.
So when you started, what was let's say the first vision and dream or idea, that's the right word? Was it sort of, all the learnings you had from UFA and IMG and just, rebundling it now on your own, of course, or was there something different? What was it? Was there a different twist to it? What was sort of the big picture there when you started, before we get into more of the nitty gritty here?
Well, I think, first of all, we simply wanted to do business, but
and make some money. That's all good.
Well, have fun and make money, was one of our mottos here. But of course, there was the idea of a house of football by basically having 5 major divisions, which was media rights, sponsorship, events, players, plus tour organizing and tournaments, the 5 big business areas at that time, who would basically support and complement each other and create a lot of synergies. And
but all around football, or was it outside? Were you looking beyond football?
One of our first interns was Kalle Sauerland, the son of the famous German box promoter.
Yes.
Who worked a lot with us and basically was our first employee and brought in, of course, boxing competence and boxing business. So we did a lot on boxing too, but 90% of the business, or even 95%, was just football. That was our competence. And I still would say, you should stick to the sports you understand, although media rights is a different thing, and you could probably sell media rights for a sport which you do not understand. But if you want to get deeply involved into sports marketing, I think you need to understand the sport. And I would say I would be still a horrible agent in marketing cricket, a sport which I would probably or will never understand as a child.
That's fair enough. So let's with your, what was it, Cyprus little matches here and there, obviously that's, you got started, but where was sort of the big breakthrough? Sorry.
Yeah, we there was a second angle, because we've seen, of course, also a lot of red tape, in a German company, and then, of course, even in an American, although it's much less formal than a German company, but you see, of course, in an American company at that time at ING, similar amounts of red tape and politics. And that was something also we from day one wanted to avoid, and which was, I think, in hindsight, part of our success story, quick decision making. Because, as you know, the football business is very fast. Still today, although we are dealing with huge amounts of money, which normally involve institutional involvement, and institutional investors, and then the necessary board meetings, etc. One of our big advantages was that we could decide on site very quickly, because what I'm always saying is no one cares about the games from last night, and you cannot rest on the success from yesterday, because tomorrow is another day.
The next match,
and in principle, the next match, and you start from scratch, And so this was something, even when we became much bigger than in the next years, we always looked at it very carefully to have very fast decision-making processes.
Now, again, you mentioned earlier you had some investors, so there was, when you had to write some larger checks, there was some funding available to put money in there. I'm assuming it wasn't just your own money, right?
Yeah, it was own money, and then of course we had some people who helped us, but obviously we were quite lucky in the economic development of the company. So we earned from day one substantial monies, which we always reinvested. And then, of course, when we were involved in bigger projects, you were looking, of course, constantly for funding and refunding these investments. Of course, football, I always mention, it's a cash business where when you at that time signed whatever kind of deal, you were always asked by the rights holders for significant down payments, Right. Even years before the contract actually started, because you signed these agreements probably 2 years in advance, while old companies or competitors were still holding these rights. Even then, you had to bring on the table sometimes 50% of the overall value of the contract.
And I got to jump in here because I remember the story you told me last time that those agents on the other side, people representing the clubs, weren't always the people who were actually with the club, right? So there were some deals which you mentioned, I think you mentioned before, something that maybe not yourself, but others ended up paying money to, obviously some guy who just, acted like he was belonged to the club and then ran off with the money. So you had a bit of both, right, on all sides.
The wild days in the early 90s where we tried at UFA to get as many contracts as possible. And one of the basically tools we had, of course, we could offer clubs a so-called signing fee, basically a non-refundable one-off payment, which was not even connected to the rights fees, but an initiative to sign a long-term rights deal, a representation deal with our company. And we were talking here to clubs from first divisions in Europe, probably not clubs from the Premier League at that time, who was already starting and very successful. But when we are talking about a Polish first division club now or a Russian club, and you offered them a couple of 100,000 German marks at that time, something like whatever, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 euros. This was sometimes the annual budget of the clubs at that time. So there was a huge incentive. And I mentioned already the downfall of the Iron Curtain and the major restructuring of football there. And of course, this business was then also sometimes used by criminal elements. And we even had people once coming into our office who pretended to be the representatives of a club. And when we basically signed the contract, of course, they got their money. And when we sent our congratulation fax to the club, I think it was somewhere in Belarus or Russia, we got a short answer from the club. We do not understand your fax. No one of our club board was ever in Hamburg signing a contract. So it was probably very easy to make money at that time, just getting an old club blazer and traveling one or two of these agencies and cashing in signing fees for signing contracts.
That's a good story. Now, coming back to KENTARO here. So, see, as you said, you had events, sponsorship, media rights, player, you had, I think, 500 players under an agency as well. What was sort of the biggest part of the company? What was it really? What was sort of you guys were making the most money, or you would always consider it was sort of your crown jewel in what you were doing?
A couple of successful projects. Of course, media rights was at that time still very, very much booming. National team games. At that time, club business was already more or less non-existent due to the centralization of the Champions League, and then later, of course, also to the Europe League. So agencies could only market qualifying games to the major rounds, and that was of minor interest. We were very successful in media rights of federations. We were involved in some league deals. We had the domestic league rights in Sweden, a massive project. And of course, we had a lot of players. We did the same like we did at IMG, acquiring a couple of agencies. We've learned a little bit because we only bought 51% of the shares of these companies in order to consolidate them, but in return also leave enough incentives for the people. Most of these guys we also knew for a long time, so this worked much better than we did before at IMG. And we created something like I would say, a new business by arranging big friendly matches on neutral ground.
Right.
I remember I was...
Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil is a good example. It actually started with a game in Geneva where we organized England against Argentina. At that time, the English FA needed a away game in order to fulfill one of their television contracts. I think they needed to deliver to ITV an additional away game. And I said, why don't you come to Geneva? Yeah, because that was very convenient from London to fly to Geneva. There were a lot of expats and also for English fans, easy to reach. And we got hold of Argentina and brought the Argies to Geneva and had suddenly on a gruesome November day in 2005, a friendly game between two countries on a neutral ground. Yeah, the game was massive because, of course, England-Argentina was never a friendly. It was a little bit like Germany-Holland. You know, there was a big history starting with the Falklands and so on. The English or the Argies were leading, I think, 2-1 until the 89th minute, until little Michael Owen scored twice, and England won 3-2. So it was a perfect day. And for us, it was the start of a new idea because suddenly we had television rights into both territories. We could market games in territory where there is no strong national team. Geneva, I think, had a nice little stadium. They never had a big game. And they never had the chance to see teams like Argentina or England. So you could say them quickly out. And we created the Brazil World Tour, by signing Brazil. And
where did you all take them? I mean, because I remember even we were talking about that time, I think even, trying to do one here in Asia, which never happened. But where did you take these guys? Because I know initially it was a lot of Europe, because a lot of the players were in Europe anyway, right?
In total, we were responsible for organizing 120 Brazil games around the globe. Yeah, and then I think a further 70 or 80 with Argentina. And then a lot of other games with smaller nations. Yeah, but the Brazil games were massive because wherever we went at that time, there was Yoga Bonita. This was the biggest team in the world. And we set up the full infrastructure on our own. Yeah, we had from ticketing down to merchandising and the VIP room. We run everything in-house. Of course, there was massive pressure because the CBF got a lot of money from this contract per game, guaranteed. So it was in their interest that we would organize at every possible FIFA match day a game. So sometimes we had to organize games overnight. Yeah, I remember we organized once a game in Barcelona, which was a game Brazil against Ecuador. At that time, the president of the Spanish FA had certain political issues with the president of the Brazilian FA. So for whatsoever reason, he didn't give us final approval for organizing these games because FIFA regulations always said you need to have approval by the host federation in the country. We already had plastered the city of Barcelona with match day posters and flyers in order to sell the ticketing, and the game was, I think, 5 days ahead. But we put basically everyone in a jet and we're flying to Stockholm and organized the entire game, Brazil-Ecuador, within 5 days in Stockholm. Of course, it was sold out. I think the day after we arrived in Stockholm, we started ticket sales, and there was a, 1 kilometer queue around the corner in our office in Stockholm for people queuing up for the tickets, because at that time Brazil was the superstar team with Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, Kaká, and so on, and everyone wanted to watch that.
That's, I mean, already, obviously, we've done games too. and game is always a massive undertaking, right? The logistics of it, and of course selling tickets and setting up the venue and you name it, and doing 120 of those things is just insane over that I guess 10 plus years. There's wow.
Yes, and they were impressive. All massive. Yeah, I remember. I think we did Argentina, Brazil in the Meadowlands Stadium in New Jersey. That was after the World Cup 2010. It was basically Messi against Neymar. Sold tickets, 100,000 tickets for $100 each. Yeah, I mean $100 for a friendly is a lot. Yeah, especially for European pricing. Of course, for an NFL ticket, it's nothing. Yeah, but we were talk of the town in New York on that night. Yeah, and but we went also to very crazy destinations. And it was always very successful because everyone loved Brazil, and there were a lot of Brazilians around the world, yeah? And of course, a lot of people loved simply Brazilian football. Yeah? So there were hardly any matches which were not successful.
Interesting.
Now, you have the right logistics, etc. Was a hard-working team. We had a whole event division there who night and day worked from hotels over buses, etc. I think one of the most crazy things we ever did was organizing a pre-World Cup training camp in the center of Switzerland in Vegas, a little village. Where at that time we generated roughly around $20 million on revenues for 5 or 6 days of training. So we sold tickets for people watching the training camp and transmitted the training sessions of Ronaldinho, how he was running up and down the pitch into 65 countries. So it gives you a little bit, an idea about the impact of Brazil at that time.
Yeah, I love it. It's funny. It's great. I mean, you know what? And the stuff still happens, right? I mean, you're aware of that. We're putting together a match here, and by the time the podcast is live, the press conference will be out there. So we're bringing Liverpool and Man United here. We're not the promoter, but we are the agency who put it all together, and it still works. And similar. The tickets are expensive, but it's the two biggest football clubs in the world, especially here for this region. And we'll have a full house and crazy fans around here. So those matches, if you get the right ones, they can be lucrative, and of course, and they can be very exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think national team games have lost a lot of their appeal. Yeah. Now you have the super clubs who, of course, do this now much more strategically. We did a couple of games with Liverpool and also then with Man United and training camps, etc. We had always a very strong relationship to the sporting sides of the clubs. Yeah, that helped a lot. And even at that time, I remember that Man United asked crazy money, which was very, very difficult to refinance. But nothing compared to the money they get now when they go overseas. Yeah, but we were definitely shaping this part of the business. Yeah, and you mentioned a little bit the players' business. Indeed, we had around 500 players in the books, so massive. I don't know if they all existed or if there were some skeletons among them, but I think there were more than 250 national team players involved. Yeah, and we had bought the biggest agency at that time in the UK, so we were also managing some of the biggest stars at that time in the Premier League because our partner, the Jerome Anderson, was instrumental in bringing the first big superstars into the Premier League, like Dennis Bergkamp, Thierry Henry, Emmanuel Petit, etc. And I think we even had Zlatan Ibrahimovic in our books because our Swedish agency was managing him until he then went to Mino Raiola. Yeah, so the first two.
So you had your fingers everywhere, basically. So,
yeah,
starting between the two of you there, at the end, let's say not at the end maybe, but sort of at the peak, how many people were you, and what was sort of some numbers you can share just to get a sense and scale and size?
Around the world, and more than 150 people working for us, and a turnover of roughly $200 million. Yeah, so
nice.
was, of course, nothing against, companies like IMG, etc. But it was a nice business, and very thriving business. Yes.
Yeah. Last time we talked a bit about it, and because I've had obviously that same experience on my end here, is that partially part of the problem of our industry is, of course, is that the overheads are large, right? You have an expensive team of people flying around the world, doing the business we're doing, and the more successful those guys become, the more they want, and the more expensive it gets to keep them. And so you're always kind of chasing a little bit your own tail there. What sort of your take on that?
No, absolutely. I always remember I had at that time already a banking partner, which was giving us a massive loan. And this was a fund from Luxembourg who later came also into administration and was taken over by a very, very strict guy, who made the turnaround of a lot of business. He didn't have a clue about football. And I came into the office and introduced myself, and he said, "Oh, football, that's all bullshit, And then he looked into our balance sheet or P&L and our numbers, and he said, "What? You have 20 million euro overheads? How should that work, And of course, I was defending our business. Yeah, I sometimes need to smile when I think about it, because he might have been right. Yeah, because the business became much more transparent. You didn't have anymore the pioneer winnings from the 90s we discussed before. Principle, you had to work on a 20% commission base, yeah, and that basically means when you have a 20% margin and you have 20 million overheads, the first 100 million euros or dollars of your turnover,
bring straight out of the window.
Yeah, close to break even, but only under the condition that all of your 20% deals are fully working, yeah, and we all know that there are businesses, where you also have to invest a lot of money and you are not very lucky or successful. Right. So basically, you are absolutely right. Now you have every morning huge pressure to work against your cost base. And this, of course, was also very much connected to the wages and salaries in our industry. We all benefited in one part from that. But when you then basically running your own company, you also are facing the crazy monies which are spent for wages and bonuses, etc., which was, I think, part of the connection to the football industry. Now, we recently discussed that the bus driver of Borussia Dortmund had a winning bonus in his contract. So whenever the team was winning, he got a bonus.
Really? Okay.
So in my next life, I become also the bus driver of Dortmund, but connected also to our situation in London, where the whole economic business and climate and the way how people are dealing was very much influenced about the city and the banks there. Then yes, there were a lot of situations where a young employee who for the first time in his life sent an email came the next day to you and asked for a share in the company. And of course, a share in bonuses. So this was a situation which was not always easy to deal with. And I would say, in general, in the football business, salaries and wages are still very, very high.
Absolutely. Now, before we sort of starting to kind of close in here and wrap things a bit up here, there's a few more things I want to touch on. One is, of course, some Asian story here, especially Thailand, where I'm calling from here, and your involvement with Manchester City and Thaksin here. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I know you are currently based in Bangkok, and somehow a city we did a lot of business, because after signing up all European federations, we basically had the idea, now let's conquer the world.
Do the same in Asia. Right?
Yeah, and do the same in Asia. At that time, the Asian market wasn't developed like today. I think the only meaningful TV monies you got from for a national game was from Japan and South Korea. So clearly we were very, very early there, and maybe a little bit too early.
It wasn't so easy, yeah.
Yeah, I remember we once signed the Federation of Guam, yeah, until we found out that they even didn't have their own pitch. I don't know if that has been rectified.
We did some deals together at that time when you had some of the Asian teams here. I think I remember that now.
Oh, yeah. And of course, one of our favorite deals we had was somehow the Thai Federation. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we ever made money on this. We organized once a year the King's Cup, a tournament in, I don't know, mid-January, where it was very difficult to find national teams to play in the mid of January outside of FIFA dates in Bangkok. Yep. But we had a close contact to the federation, and somehow the president of the federation was also very close to the president of Thailand, which was Mr. Thaksin. Mm-hmm. And we were once driving through London and just wanted to have a coffee in the Dorchester, famous hotel and Park Lane. Yep. And bumped into Mr. Thaksin, who was just kicked out of Thailand due to a military coup, and told us about his fantastic marketing campaign now to basically whitewash his name and to get back into power in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And for whatsoever reason, we said, we have a better idea. Yeah? Why don't you buy a Premier League club? And via this, you can basically wave every Saturday into the television cameras and then broadcast your manager back into Thailand.
Right. Yeah? Well, why not?
That's the beginning of this. So we were involved in a couple of M&A deals in the Premier League, where we basically did a little bit like a investment banking boutique, because again, doing the deals wasn't most complicated, because we were dealing here with classic English limiteds. So I remember the transaction of Man City, I think we did within 24 or 48 hours. Yeah. Wow. It's not very rocket science. The only thing which, again, a classic investment bank could not do was to bring the decisive or the decision makers on one table, because in principle you were dealing with a crazy billionaire on one side, and also the selling parties were illustrious businessmen with huge egos. And I think the most difficult part of the deal was to bring them into
manage them. Yep, absolutely.
And to nail the deal. The rest was than business as usual.
Yeah. I think if anything, both of us and anyone in our industry who's been in this space for long enough really learned is that managing of egos, right? Because that's what you as an agency always have to do, right? The egos on both sides of the table, whether it's a big broadcaster who has plenty of money, or as you said, it's the federation or the team or someone who obviously has equal power there. And we're always the guys in the middle, right? So I think we do get quite good at that part. I believe so.
No, you're absolutely right. And a very clever guy from the industry told me very early that the people who are in the clubs and federation business and top positions and presidents, they are at the end only there because of their egos, because they want to see their own picture in the papers, And look, when I ask you, do you know the CEO of Bayern, one of the biggest companies in the world? To be honest, I don't know even his name. When we are talking about the CEO of Bayern Munich, the media footprint, which is 100 times bigger than the CEO of Bayer. And that, of course, is very interesting for people who are looking to have their picture on the front page of all the magazines.
Yeah. Now, to kind of, come a bit to obviously what you're doing now as well, KENTARO obviously did close its doors, and as usual, there were all sort of stories around it, and people can read it. Love to hear a bit from your point of view, what happened, from your angle.
Well, there were a couple of reasons. Now, ultimately, I would say every company has a certain lifespan. Yeah, when you look at the agency scene, most of the big agencies, are hardly existing anymore, are in trouble. Yeah, so, but of course, it had also to do with some political issues we had, which was also connected to the federation business we did. Yeah, so as you know, this was also centralized in Europe by Mr. Platini. So a big part of our business was then also ending. Yeah, and that has changed, of course, also the agency landscape a lot. Right. But in principle, we all know this. As an agency, you need to reinvent yourself every 6 months. I would say this is not anymore relevant to the sports industry alone. We are talking probably about every business in the world, which is in global competition. So life goes on, and yes, you have to reinvent yourself probably now every 3 months. Otherwise, you're gone.
Yeah. So what is Mr. Philipp doing now? How did you reinvent yourself here? Talk about that.
I'm back in Germany now after nearly 20 years or 18 years in London. I think normally people managed to stand 10 years in London, because it's such a busy city, and definitely a city where you do not want to retire. And I mentioned that I left Germany in 1999 for a couple of reasons, and these were more or less the same reasons why I eventually went back. So I moved to Berlin in 2017. And Berlin is, to a certain extent, one of the most dynamic cities now in the world, especially in our industry. As you know, the media business in Germany was always divided between Hamburg and Munich. This has changed now a lot, and a lot of the media business is coming out of Berlin. So you meet a lot of people here. And we set up here with partners a new business called Akani, also dealing a lot with sport and entertainment. We do also some other stuff. And when you look at the pandemic situation in the last 2 years, there were, I think, a couple of things, where the industry had to learn a lot from, because we mentioned that before. It's probably the first time in history, at least in my career, that football is realizing now that the sky is not anymore the limit. The COVID crisis is completely different than all the other economic crises before. We talked about the dot-com bubble in 2003 or the financial crisis in 2008, which had a massive impact on world economics and also on a lot of other sports, but never on football. Even in times of tight budgets, broadcasters were basically cutting secondary programs, but were keeping football, on their screens or in their sponsorship portfolios. And this has changed now for the first time, because partly games were not even played. And that, I think, was a massive shock for a lot of people in the industry. And it's coming at the time which already before COVID showed that there is, at least in certain parts now, for the first time also in a long time, or even I would say history, a certain basically stop on the increase of revenues. We are talking about media rights, of course, the traditional media rights, where big European leagues like the Premier League could manage at least to stay on the same level, while other leagues, look at the Bundesliga, had a massive decline in their revenues domestically, and where people need to think very carefully now how to consolidate their businesses and to see where is the growth rate. Because at the same time, you see still the massive growth in wages and salaries of the players. And although everyone says, oh no, player salaries need to get down, everyone knows this is complete bullshit, due to some drivers in the industry who are economically independent, like top clubs who are basically financed by state funds.
But coming back to Akani, I mean,
Yes.
remember what we just said before. I think you're doing some stuff with NFTs and avatars and the metaverse and so on. Just talk a bit about that. What exactly are the things you guys are doing?
That's what I just wanted to mention. We work very much with the monetization of fan communities. We manage a couple of stars and celebrities, and do a lot with basically NFTs now, which to a certain extent is pretty similar, like all the other developments we both witnesses to see, and a lot of things is for us business as usual, because again it's speed and development. So we are doing this, and a couple
mostly focused around what again. Football a bit or completely different things?
Very much players we do celebrities, marketing, and we are also consulting some clubs and leagues. We have an office in Morocco because partners of mine have an Arabian background. So we work also in the Northern African part of the football business. And we have a base in Riyadh, a very interesting country, and developing there a partnership currently.
Saudi as well. All right.
Yes. So, and of course we do, the usual business. We do not deal a lot anymore in media rights because, as you know, this is mainly centralized now. And
that business is over and done. That's for many of us. There's a few still in it, but that has really dramatically shifted away from the agencies. Philip, I think we could go on here forever, as we normally do when we are chatting, just between us, not on radio, so to speak here, where we go on for hours, which is always fun. So, but in essence of time here, I want to sort of start wrapping it up here. Just maybe let's have a little final last look here. You're looking back at the last 25 years, and as I said, obviously football was a big theme, and you already touched on it, that salaries are still continues to grow for players, and but the money in the game is maybe has shifted. It's probably not necessarily less, but it's clearly moving from certain traditional revenue streams to new spaces, and we all need to kind of take watch that and be part of it. What's your sort of thought on it? Sort of final thought here for the evening here on a Sunday.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm very thankful, for the things I have learned in this industry. As you know, it's a 24/7 business, and I think we never had holidays. So it's of course due to the speed and to the fact that somewhere someone is.
Most people would say we never worked either, but that's a different story.
Or we always work, because someone somewhere is always playing football, and right. It's a global business, So yes, you put a lot of energy and sleepless nights into this, but in return, of course, you make incredible experiences, and countries on a global base, and sometimes you even develop friendships. So this is something which I think we all should be very grateful about, the global connection, in this business, and that was always the thing which I really or still like most on this. The other thing is, of course, what I just mentioned, that you could never stop. It's not like dealing whatever with a patent, or you are inventing something and can live the rest of your life from the royalties. In principle, we all need to get up the next morning and make the next deal and reinvent yourself, which I mentioned, which is of course also quite nerve-wracking. But on the other side, it keeps you young. Yeah, and I think this is with all the digital, I remember one thing, we helped to open the new Wembley Stadium. Because the English FA spent a lot of money there, and they couldn't even pay Brazil anymore. So we basically brought Brazil to open the Wembley Stadium. And it was a fantastic early summer day in London, and 90,000 people in the Wembley Stadium, and a fantastic game between England and Brazil. And I was wondering, well, this is fantastic. What should come thereafter? And I remember the next morning I was on a plane somewhere to Azerbaijan, dealing about UEFA Cup rights, and it's exactly what I just said. No one cares about of the game last night, which of course keeps us all very young, and very juvenile, because you need to go with the latest trends, and I would also recommend this to everyone who wants to join the industry, also the younger people, that of course with all the digital possibilities now, and the new platforms coming up, I think there's hardly a time where you had more chances to be successful in this business when you grab the opportunities, and are smart and clever and fast. And look, older veterans like you and me, we need to manage to cope with the speed. But still, I would say we are in the game.
Absolutely. I think the experience does count for something here. And for my last thoughts on what you just shared is, I think there are a couple of things. One is, like I said, yes, the reinvention of an agency, I think it's definitely true. And when I look at TSA, I always say we're at TSA 5.0 or 6 now, and if constantly reinventing that. I also agree with that. It's difficult to build strong assets, right? Because you can't own things. It's or more difficult to own things in the industry, right? That's one. And so, someone compared our industry a bit to investment banking, which is very similar, right? You're always as good as your next deal, right? And you always have to find, the next company you take public or the next whatever deal you're brokering. And so I think that's really what sports marketing is all about. And guys like us have done it, obviously, and we drove and thrived by that. But it's not as simple as it sounds like, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Philipp, this was a lot of fun. And as I said, I know you have a day ahead of you here in Berlin, so enjoy your day. Thanks for the talk. Enjoyed it a lot too, and I'm sure we'll talk some more soon.
Thank you very much, Markus. Take care, and all
Definitely.
The best.
Same to you. Tschüss.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Markus Luhr podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Markus Luhr. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.